now.
Okay. Oh, see.
Okay. I think we've got a few more people joining. But hello, everyone. Thank you for joining our webinar on Stoicism and the environment today. Before I hand over to Justin and our speakers, I want to tell you that there will be a question and answer session at the end of the webinar. So please use the Q&A function in your Zoom toolbar to submit any questions at any time. Today, we will not be using the raise the hand tool, so it will just be the Q&A function. You're also welcome to leave comments and feedback in the chat or via email or our social channels, which are Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. So let's get started. Over to Justin, founder of the foundation.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us this afternoon. We're very pleased with the first webinar we had a number of weeks ago, and the follow-up and the engagement and the inquiries were again very, very pleasing. So we're pleased with the way the foundation is moving and the things that we're doing, and we appreciate everyone's interest, commitment, and engagement, and we'll keep moving forward as such. Considering that the lockdown remains quite strong here in the UK, we'll continue to think about foundation activities, within the context of that lockdown. So this afternoon, I'm very pleased to be joined by Mr. Tom Hill and Professor Christopher Gill, and we're going to talk a little bit around the environment. And there's been quite a few questions come up considering the news media centering more about the environmental impact of the lockdown, and starting to move towards conversations that the environment can be affected positively by less economic activity. And there's measurements and all sorts of data and analytics looking into the effect of the lockdown globally as far as its effect on the environment as we know it. So there's been quite a bit of dialogue around this. So I'm going to share my screen here, which will be the basis of this afternoon's conversation. So, in part of the foundation itself, we believe as aspiring Stoics that we have an individual responsibility to be aware of Stoicism and enjoy the journey of understanding and build an individual life contribution around Stoic behaviors. But also that ties into global community engagement with global initiatives and being part of the wider community and the wider environment. And so that's a very important part of the foundation as we go forward here in terms of activities, participations on all sorts of levels. And it was in the original mandate that the founders of the foundation. So that's an important part of this afternoon in terms of what we're trying to achieve. And then again, it comes back to being a businessman, trying to continually encourage businesses to be a part of the conversation around the ESG strategy, environmental concern, and sustainability for businesses going forward. So these two parts of the mandate and the vision of the foundation continue to be very important to us and tie into this afternoon's conversation. Again, very pleased to have Professor Christopher Gill with us, Emeritus Professor of Ancient Thought at University of Exeter, has held posts at Yale, Bristol, and other such universities, and has written many books around the ideas of personality, self, ancient psychology, ancient psychotherapy, ethics, Stoicism, Marcus Aurelius, and Plato. And he is also an advisor to the Aurelius Foundation. We're very pleased to have Chris with us this afternoon as a guiding light within the Foundation's initiatives. And Tom, who will lead the conversation this afternoon. Tom is an ecological economist and aspiring Stoic who's an expert in climate and environmental policy. In particular, he has an interest in how policy helps avert climate and nature crises by bringing about a just transition to a sustainable economy. Tom has previously worked for the Institute for Public Policy Research in the United Kingdom, where he led the Institute's research in relation to climate and energy. So without further ado, we're going to have Tom take us through some slides and some commentary. Then we'll have a transition to Chris, who's going to put some Stoic framework around that. And then we're going to open it up to questions to the three of us to close out the session. So without further ado, Tom, over to you.
Okay, so can people see the slides? I can't see the slides.
Oop. Let me go there 1 second. Apologies, everyone. Just getting there myself. There we go. Can we see that, Tom? Can you see that?
Yeah, so can you can maximize that, can't you?
Okay. So basically what I just spoke to, I've just spoken to.
Okay.
So without further ado, forgive me on that. It's a good thing to start the slides. Tom, over to you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Up until about a month ago, I worked for the Institute for Public Policy Research, which some of the people on the webinar may be familiar with. And in IPPR, my capacity, as Justin mentioned, was to lead the work or look at the work that we were doing around energy and climate. At IPPR, we were working on something called the Environmental Justice Commission. And so I thought a good place to start might be to just summarise a report that IPPR released last week, which gives a slight overview of why I think the environment is important and how that links to a justice narrative, which then I understand that Chris will then pick up later when he's talking about Stoicism and environmental ethics. So a good place to start is back in 2015, 2016, governments were negotiating the Paris Agreement. And one of the things which came out from that was an agreement to try and avert global warming of more than 2 degrees Celsius. And in addition to that, they wanted to pull out all the stops to try and actually take that further and avoid a 1.5 degree rise. Because what they found is that although they knew that different levels of warming had different consequences, they weren't that confident at the exact difference between a 1.5 degree level of warming and a 2 degree level of warming. So following on from the Paris Agreement, they set the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change a task to produce a report that actually looked at that in detail. And this table here shows summarizes the difference, and basically what it found, and it basically corroborated scientists' previous knowledge, was that small rises in temperature have non-linear rises in impact. So at the moment we've had about 1 degree rise in temperatures against pre-industrial averages, and we're quite close to passing a threshold that would prevent us from rising beyond 1.5. However, the relative impact between a 1.5 and a 2 degree are quite significant. So there's a few of the stats there. So you're looking at a 38% worse loss of permafrost if you end up with a 2 degree rise in temperature against a 1.5 degree rise, and crop yields reductions more than double. Instead of actually losing only 70 to 90% of coral reefs at 1.5, we'll lose 99%. And just to give you a bit of context there, currently there's about 19 million square kilometers of permafrost in the Arctic. So we're looking at losing almost a third in a 2 degree scenario. And then you can look at the same sorts of stats with fisheries and extreme heat. And with extreme heat, you're looking at situations that are not necessarily conducive for people to live in those environments. If you scroll down to the next page, similar stats can be found on the next tab. With a 2 degree rise, we're looking at once every 10 years that there's sea ice-free Arctic, which raises questions of things like how certain ecosystems, things like polar bears and stuff, can exist within that. Now, things like polar bears are very iconic and are often used by the likes of WWF, but there's obviously wider social and environmental consequences as well. So there's whole communities that are dependent upon those ecosystems, not to mention a lot of the wider integrity of the world's ecosystems that are dependent upon everything being roughly in balance. Same things in terms of species loss. Significant levels of climate change are considered to have high probability of leading to high levels of species loss, particularly with the likes of things like insects. If we scroll to the next page. So next question is, okay, so how significant is the challenge in order to try and stay within 1.5? If you look at historical emissions, some of you might have seen this before. If we look at historical emissions, they've been rising basically exponentially since the Industrial Revolution. We've got roughly about 9 years of current levels of greenhouse gas emissions to stay within a 66, so that's deemed a likely chance of staying within 1.5. And we've got slightly longer for a 2-degree rise, but 27 years isn't very long within the scheme of things. Hopefully within all of the people's lifetime who are present here, but certainly within the presence of their family members' lifetime. You scroll to the next page. In order to stay within, however, in order to stay within 1.5 degrees, that's the change in emissions trajectory that we need to move to, which is what I would describe as being quite a scary emissions reduction slope that we're targeting. I feel like within the public policy arena, the actual scale of the challenge is not often discussed, which is one of the reasons I'm putting it here. The situation we're facing with regards to climate is extremely urgent and extremely dire. And if we don't deal with it immediately and very significantly, we're going to face highly significant problems in the future. The trends that I mentioned on the previous slide get even worse. When you rise to higher levels, so let's say 3 degrees or 4 degrees of temperature, again, they'd be non-linear and much more significant than at 1.5 and 2. Next slide, please. If you move outside of the focus of climate change and greenhouse gases and carbon emissions, you can see similar trends happening with other planetary boundaries. So scientists at the Stockholm Resilience Centre have identified 9 planetary boundaries that basically are important for the ecosystem integrity and the provision of life on Earth. For 3 of them at least, we are significantly exceeding or transgressing the planetary boundaries, particularly with regards to things like biodiversity and genetic diversity, where scientists believe that we're now within the 6th major mass extinction event, geologists have coined the phrase the Anthropocene to reflect the changes that we're inflicting upon the environment. Other areas that are significant to the ways that we're polluting our water courses through the use of fertilizers and like nitrogen and phosphate on the environment. Land use change is another one, so deforestation, particularly within tropical areas and so on. Next slide, please. So to bring in a justice angle to this, not all people who are causing impact are equal. So if you look at the G7 average who are contributing to these problems, they're significantly higher than the rest of the world. So this shows the G7 most economically developed countries. And if you look at the different types of indicator I mentioned on the previous page, so nitrogen, carbon dioxide emissions, phosphate, material footprint, ecological footprint, land use and water related consumption. In all of those, except for maybe land use intensity in blue water, the G7 significantly exceeds the average. And that basically pertains to inequality in consumption and inequality in impact. So there's a good case to say, and this has happened both in present terms and also in historic terms. So there's a good case to be saying that those of us who live in rich and developed countries should be taking a lead on responding to this crisis. Next slide. Again, also, even within these G7 countries, all impacts aren't equal. So this one's actually a relatively stable graph, but basically shows that consumption-related emissions, so the emissions associated with the stuff that we, the products and services that we buy, generally increase with income decile. So those of us in the higher ends of the income deciles or quintiles that are here, no, quartiles that are here, are having a bigger impact than those of us who are lower down. If you take the top 1%, it's even more significant than what's shown here. Next slide, please. Similar, as you might expect, across other types of basically privilege or disadvantage, people who are white generally have a significantly bigger impact than people who are BAME or not white. Next slide, please. Within, in terms of the age cohort, there's different age-related impacts. It's generally seen that people who are in their 60s have a larger impact than other generations. That's partially because that impact is heavily correlated with wealth, and generally speaking that by the time that people have reached those ages, they have slightly more income than other groups. Next slide, please. So moving on, that was to give a very whistle-stop kind of view of background in which we're facing and how that has a justice dimension. Moving forward and looking more specifically around how the COVID crisis and the COVID pandemic has had an impact in terms of the climate. Now, rolling into the links between the coronavirus and climate and environmental breakdown, as yet, people aren't that confident in what's caused COVID-19. As I understand it, there's quite strong evidence that it was derived from bats, or it was transmitted from bats rather. However, the exact vectors in which it actually arrived in human populations are unclear. Some people think it was connected to through the use of some sort of forms of bushmeat within wet markets within Wuhan, but that hasn't been firmly established yet. What some people are speculating at the moment that might be that there's a link between essentially human appropriation of natural habitats, and so as we've basically gone further and further into what was previously pristine habitats, and as we've reduced the amount of pristine habitats available, what's happened is things like coronavirus have got more heavily concentrated within those environments, and that's increased the risk for when we move into them. So one concern is that that basically the robustness of ecosystems is declining, which means that then the risks associated with future pandemics could be increasing. As I mentioned, though, that this is still an emerging area of research, and it's still I imagine that we'll get more clarity of this going forward. In terms of the impact that COVID-19 has had on the environment, that's quite varied and quite complex. So if we can move on to the next slide, please, Justin. So in terms of things like the greenhouse gas emissions, it's been widely reported that greenhouse gas emissions or CO2 emissions have declined as a result of COVID-19. That's true, but the reports vary from about 5 to 10% compared to 2019 values. Now, in order to stay within a 1.5 degree budget, we need to have about a 9 or 10% reduction each and every year, and that needs to be sustained and compounded on top of each other. And now, On purely on a carbon basis, you can argue that that actually this is not a good story for a few reasons. One, that it's been incredibly painful for a lot of people, and it's a very undesirable way of reducing emissions. But it also shows that, the scale of the challenge, that even if we basically freeze the whole economy for a few months, that it only has almost like the bare minimum level of impact that we need to achieve. However, the kind of the silver lining is that shutting down the economy is never, it was focused on tackling COVID-19. It was never designed to be tackling carbon emissions. So a lot of the things like, so while we may be moving around and being transported less, we're also at home more, maybe using more heating. So there's only so much we can kind of deduce from that. However, it does indicate the scale of change that can happen if governments around the world do begin to take a topic seriously. And in my view, what we need to be doing is treating climate change with a similar level of urgency and importance that we treated COVID-19. You scroll to the next page, please. The story is a little bit more rosy in other types of impact though. So on the next slide, so things like air pollution, the story is much more positive because people aren't transporting around as much as they were before. Air pollution has declined quite considerably, as shown by these congestion flows in different areas. So London has seen a marked decline in congestion, same as happened in other areas, perhaps not quite to the same extent. If you move on to the next slide, widely reported is that there's been lots of wildlife-related benefits associated with COVID-19. So whereas previously certain types of wildlife hadn't been seen within urban environments for a long time, basically the human retreat away from basically the noise associated with that has in some areas allowed animals to reclaim some habitats that they were previously excluded from. However, there are some concerns that things like dependencies around ecotourism may undermine longer-term wildlife projects. So the narrative and story is quite complicated with regards to how COVID has impacted the environment. I think that's, oh, if we move on to the next slide. So scroll and the next one and the next one. So just to touch on briefly, 2 more slides forward, please. So this is from a climate scientist called Peter Kalmus. He gives advice that has Stoic-related connotations on how, if those of us who are convinced that climate and environment is an important issue and that it's worthy of practicing our Stoic virtue on, that he gives these suggestions on the way that we can do it. So what's interesting here is there's a mix of both individual action and also the way that we use our individual voices to influence and engage with society. So using our voice by talking about it in these sorts of events or on social media or your friends, family, through your workplace and so on. Linking up with other people who have different skills who can help you and making basically allegiances and supporting one another. Practicing integrity and walking the talk, and that draws on everything from courage to wisdom and temperance. We have to, although there's this common idea that Stoicism is each man or woman on their own island, actually it's quite the opposite. We need to use the knowledge and wisdom that we cultivate to engage politically, to talk about these issues, and then we get stronger through developing our capacities to do that, and then basically playing around with it. And there's lots of different ways we can contribute to this issue, and that being courageously creative is the way that we can help and bring about change. That's me for now. I'll pass over to Chris now.
Okay. I'll talk more about the Stoic angle now. So why should a modern Stoic do anything to try to combat climate change? I think there's two main kinds of reasons, to do with their view of nature and their view of virtue and happiness. So let's take nature first of all. For the Stoics, happiness isn't just being in a contented state of mind, but leading a certain kind of life, what they call the life according to nature. And the life according to nature is partly leading a life according to the best principles of being human, which they Stoics see as being rational and sociable and caring for other human beings. And that means all or any human being, because the Stoics believe in the fundamental brotherhood or co-citizenship of all human beings. So for a Stoic in 2020, the most important thing she can do for other human beings, for the world community of which she is a part, is to do all she can to counteract climate breakdown at the individual or the social and political level. So that's part of it, living the life according to human nature. The Stoics also see themselves as fundamentally part of nature as a whole, part of the world or the universe or the larger environment. And they see nature as essentially something ordered and benevolent, something that has an inherent structure and wholeness, and that embodies a kind of benevolent care for everything within it: sea, air, plants, animals, and human beings. Now, a modern Stoic may not share in all respects the ancient Stoic worldview, but we can still see, as modern thinkers, nature as something that should be ordered and something that should sustain life and existence for all elements within it. Climate breakdown is a collapse of the natural order, and it threatens the capacity of nature to sustain the life and well-being of all the elements within nature. So for those reasons, a modern Stoic has good reason to want to do all he can to maintain nature as it is. So that's two reasons, to do with human nature and to do with our place in nature as a whole, as an environment. Okay, and now I'll go on to the second part of what I want to say from a Stoic angle of what our response should be. And I'll be, in a way, saying some of the same things as Tom, but in different kind of framework. So the Stoics see happiness, the life according to nature, as something that's realized by expressing the virtues. So happiness is the life according to nature. It's also the life according to virtue. And they see the four main or cardinal virtues as being wisdom, justice, temperance or self-control, and courage. These are the four on the Aurelius Foundation logo. And they see these four virtues as mapping the main areas of human experience. The Stoics also see these virtues as unified or interdependent. So you can't express one without also expressing the others. Now, I think a modern Stoic would see these virtues as expressed not just in the way we behave towards other people, but also by the way we treat, with the way our actions bear on our environment and on climate breakdown. So I think a modern Stoic should try to express wisdom or good judgment in the choices you make in this respect, about travel, flying especially, about how much you heat or cool your house, about diet, how much meat you eat, especially beef, which has a big environmental impact. So that's a kind of area for wisdom. A modern Stoic would try to act in a way that's just towards others, gives what is due to other people, and not just your family or friends or children or grandchildren, though of course they are going to be affected by environmental breakdown, but also all human people, all human beings who are members with you of the community of humankind. A modern Stoic would try to show temperance or self-control in giving up things that she likes, that are conveniences, midweek breaks to exotic places, but which have a big environmental impact, a big carbon footprint. And a modern Stoic would show courage in standing up for environmental commitments, even if this causes social or political difficulties for her. So I think in this way, the modern Stoic is taking an ancient approach using the four virtues that the Stoics recognized as fundamental for all activities, but applying them to a modern problem and a very, as Tom has brought out, a very overwhelming, acute, intense and dangerous problem, a problem for humanity and a problem for nature, the nature we all live in, and thinking through what it means to be a Stoic in 2020. Okay, thanks.
Thank you both Chris and Tom for that overview. I'm going to stop sharing at the moment. And we've got a few questions that have come through, and I've got some separate emails that have been sent as well. I think my initial commentary around it, and we're going to be quite conscious of time today, so we've got about 5 to 10 minutes where we can open it up and answer a few questions, and also we can pick it up separately as well through the foundation, social sites and what have you. But, you know, one of the biggest things is I hear Tom's overview and see the reality of the situation, and then put it in context, Chris, with your modern Stoic approach. There's this feeling of massive disconnect that the reality of we as a species and where we're heading and the potential implications just aren't getting across fast enough, with enough impact, with enough concern on a consistent basis. From time to time, we've seen recently in the last periods in London where protesters have shut down London trying to get political attention. But it's almost the continual sustainability of to make the change. And I think COVID will be interesting to see that once the data is, you know, accumulated over the next months, will there be changes on a personal level? Will there be changes in communities? And will the political will realize that there was some silver linings to this event? And Tom, do you feel, as a first question back to you, you know, your assessment right now, Tom, on the political will to try and address this problem? I mean, you've been dealing with politicians. If you look at the broad spectrum of political will, how do you rate it right now, let's say starting in the UK, of an intent to really try and address the requirement to, you know, to put us on a more positive trajectory in terms of, you know, environmental safeguarding?
Difficult question. So I won't really. It's easy to sugarcoat it with this, but I don't think it's enough, really, if I'm honest. I think within the UK, I can only really speak for the UK's point of view, but increasingly politicians here, almost all politicians understand the scale of the challenge associated with climate change, particularly, and they're getting better at that. There's they're definitely understanding is increasing. I mean, they're trying to cover across a lot of different areas, but what they struggle with is a form of cognitive dissonance in that they're aware of how important it is, but they don't believe that the people that they're representing will vote for them or support them on this and the type of action that's required to undertake it. And because there's this sort of inertia where everybody goes, yes, this is really important, and then nothing significant happens. Now, there are hopeful signs for things like various countries' commitment to going zero carbon or net zero. That's positive. it's both extremely difficult to deliver that and also incredibly ambitious at the same time. And historically, our performance of moving forward that has been somewhat limited, and you could also argue it's a little bit too little too late. However, so basically where I'm getting to with this is there needs to be, in my view, an upswell in support for very significant change and a transformation in the way that we're doing things. Now, you could say that COVID, and there are some signs that COVID may be able to kind of birth that sort of change. However, it's a little bit too early to tell. On the one hand, it could say, you could go down this sort of, okay, you need to build back better, which is a mantra that's happening now. On the other side, you could say that actually, let's stimulate the economy, let's get everything going again, let's just do more of what we're doing before. And the direction we go in is undetermined at the moment.
I think it's a complicated thing, and I think your central point that I would take out of that as well, that unfortunately we're in a political structure right now that if you stand for some of these longer term, far-reaching, clearly very important initiatives to arrest this problem, it almost puts you into a position where you're unelectable.
Yeah, I mean, if you begin to unpack this, it's hard to, so if you look at different areas within the UK, so I'm familiar with UK policy, but you're talking about making the UK's housing stock zero carbon. That means you basically got to you've got to install either some sort of zero carbon heating system in everybody's homes. That's however millions of homes in the UK. You've got to go around in the next sort of 10 years or so and retrofit that. You've got to make them more energy efficient. You've got to, that's just heating, and then you've got to make the grid green as well, in terms of having enough renewable energy or hydrogen to do that. That's just energy. And then you look at things like people's appetite for flying. That's increasing in the UK. We're looking at building a third Heathrow, and people's appetite for flying around, and despite the impact that flying has. And again, things like what Chris said about diets and things like that. People are beginning to change, but usually what tends to happen is that when you have a policy response in one area, so you might, for example, retrofit somebody's house and put insulation in a house, you'll save them money off their energy bills. And if you ask them how they spend that money, then they'll say, actually, that's good, I've saved £200, I'm going to have another holiday abroad. And actually tackling that sort of political and social inertia is one of the challenges.
Yeah. Chris, would you add anything into that, just from your perspectives or commentary?
I would just say it's a total failure of joined up thinking, isn't it? That's the problem. People just are not putting it all together. And I think, Stoicism is actually very good at that, because it's very much about saying, well, okay, you're here you are, you've got to bring everything to bear. You've got to bring everything to bear that really matters at once. And I think that's what we need to do. It's extraordinary that people, when they talk about that, each of these different topics are put in different boxes, but they're not all. We only need to have one box. We've only got one environment. We've only got one world. And that's why all these things have to be connected. So it's getting people to make those connections, I think, is a job for us, I think, a job for anyone who thinks about these things. Some people see them, especially the young.
Basically, our ability, I think the fundamental problem really is our ability to progress in terms of science and technology. We can build upon our ancestors, and almost science is cumulative, but wisdom is learned new each time through each person. And so our technology has massively grown over the last 100 or millennia or so, but our wisdom is basically still maybe operating on a lower level, and it, in my view, will take improvements in wisdom to tackle this problem.
Yeah. I've got a question here from Turkey, in fact, from Fatia, and says here, greetings from Turkey. I am a faith my name is Fatia, a development economist. Stoic belief necessitates that living in accordance with nature requires respect to nature, wherever it is presented to us. Majority of people for a long time have been destroying nature with horrible consequences for the next generations as well. Though the pandemic has been a very bad economic disaster, it has allowed the earth to breathe through the lockdown. We see dolphins on the shores, wild animals on the streets, cleaner air and cleaner oceans. The question is, do you think the pandemic might have a lasting positive impact on people's attitude towards our beautiful world in terms of their investment and consumption behaviors? Tom?
I kind of feel like we slightly touched on that a second ago. I think it's again, it's too early to tell. I mean, I think there's what's been notable and remarkable about COVID, particularly within the UK, but I presume in other countries as well, is the way that society has actually come together, and it's brought out a kindness and a concern for other people's well-being and a kind of banding together. And what you can see is that in a kind of situation of emergency where people feel threatened, they do band together and they rally and they look after each other. And there's been a shift away, a lowering of concern around, say, just economic performance, the more concern about quality of life and people's health and well-being and looking after people. Now, that is a promising trend. And yeah, I mean, if we can sustain that, then that will be promising. Now, the challenge is that with something like COVID, people feel it very much in front of them. It feels like a close threat. Part of the problem with the climate change is people think it's an abstract concept and it's something that their children will have to deal with in 100 years' time, and they don't see it being really their problem or seeing what they can do about it. And trying to get them to understand that is a big part of the challenge.
Chris, thanks, Tom. Chris, what do you think? Do you think there'll be a pattern of, changes? Will people carry that through over a sustained period of time?
I think only if those who want change really beat the drum for it, and because I think it's clear there is an appetite. One survey showed that only 9% of people want everything to go back to what it was before, which is just extraordinary. It's quite extraordinary with that survey. But I think it is borne out also by things that a lot of people say. But I think we have, those of us who want to see change, have to stand up and make the case. Otherwise it won't. There's habit has a terrible control over people. People do like to do what they're used to doing, instead of thinking from first principles. So I think there's a possibility, but we have to work very hard to get to it, I think.
Yeah. To reiterate Chris's point, I think, I mean, the reason I'm here now is I feel like the Stoic virtues, if you understand Stoicism properly, in my view, and if you understand virtues and you also understand the nature of the climate crisis and the nature of emergency, then it becomes beholden upon you to act in a way that addresses this, because for me, it feels like a moral duty that that it's not something, whereas in the past, humans' ability to impact the environment was quite limited, and we were fewer in number, and our technology was much less significant. Today, there's so many of us, and the impact that we have had collectively on the environment has meant that we've gone from being, with the environment being almost like, if you think of the environment as being, in our ancestors' time, it was like an adult, and we were like a kind of baby. And there's nothing we could do. The adult was in control, and basically we were basically at the whim of the adult. Whereas now, as humanity has matured, we've become an adult in our own selves. Now, but the relative power that's happened is now our activities are so significant that we can actually undermine the very processes that actually sustain life on Earth. Now, because of that shift in power, That's changed the nature of virtue in my mind. And that means that actually, in order for us to be virtuous beings, we need to be able to practice courage, temperance, wisdom, and so on with regard to the environment. And if we don't factor that into how we practice virtue, then I feel like we're basically being ignorant to part of our social duties. That's my personal perspective.
I also thought in Chris's commentary there, it's such an extraordinary, colossal problem that humanity has found itself right in the heart of, based on an accumulation of activity that has been, as you well illustrated, Tom, that's been getting since the Industrial Revolution. And there is a reckoning coming. Whether we want to face into that, ignore it, and depending on some of the national interests, with the United States pulling out of the Paris Agreement, a very strong right-wing adversity in the United States of addressing climate change, a US president who certainly doesn't lean into even the conversation, let alone addressing the problem. So all of these things, but I would advocate very strongly some of the things that Chris outlined for a modern Stoic around choices on a daily basis. Walking versus taking the car. Diet, I think, is a very, very key point, and not advocating any particular diet to anyone and whatever thing they have to think about, but trying to play your individual role within the context of the community of humanity. There's going to come a point where we're all asked to do something, and much more aggressively, because this snowball is coming down the hill and it's only gathering momentum. And I thought, Chris, your points around individual considerations on a daily basis and how we're going about things, COVID has actually forced people in to do these things. Mm-hmm. I can't. I have to be more centered around certain activities. I'm certainly closer to my family and how I'm interacting, exercise in different ways, all those different things. It's been forced upon us. And I'm very curious to see what happens post-lockdown. There'll be a breakout for sure, but will some of these behaviors come through and become more sustainable? Will be very interesting to see. But the activities you mentioned, Chris, the practicalities, I think, are very good. I think very good. So it's an enormous issue. I think, Tom, some of the way you outlined it was very, very good. And it paints the picture on different scales across different age groups, across different nationalities, ethnicities, but the central message is still the same, that the problem is there and it's going to have to be addressed. And being an optimist, that's one method, but this is one area where I tend to be more concerned and lean towards that. What will an event require? What sort of event will be required for us to really move? And from a foundational standpoint, thinking more about politically, the foundation would probably look towards certain parts of the political spectrum to try and lend weight to policy around those politicians who are willing to make a stand and try and get the message across. Now, we're not trying to be political in any sense, really, but we are trying to take care of our responsibilities as Stoics, as individuals, and as a moving foundation to say that we think this is a matter of serious concern. Yeah. It needs sustained effort and sustained commitment towards. So whether it's from us or the advisor group or people who are following the foundation, if you do have ideas or you do have initiatives that we can get behind as a foundation, we would be very pleased to hear them.
I mean, can I just add to that, which is, I realise that I've been quite heavy today and quite dire in my prognosis. Now, I would consider myself to be, despite all that, an optimist. And I think this is within our human capacities to deal with, but almost the first step is a collective awakening. And I think one of the roles that Stoics can play very well is through using our capacity for reason to actually recognise the scale of the challenge that we are facing and basically try and urge this collective awakening, because we need to find, nobody's found it yet, we need to find some way of shaking people out of this this cognitive dissonance and inertia, and this sort of belief that actually we can just trundle through this and everything will be fine. It won't be. The longer we leave this, the bigger the problem is going to be, and the greater the liabilities and the greater injustices that we're dealing with. I'm strongly, I have strong conviction that we have all the technologies and all the knowledge to actually deal with this. We can deal with this. It's just actually creating the political consensus and essentially getting people to do it and persuading people and offering the right sort of vision for people to act on it. That's the challenge.
We're close to closing off based on time, that we've gone a little bit over, in fact. But there's a comment here from Agnieszka, who's put something out there for all of us, and I think it's an interesting comment. It says here, many people have been further traumatized by COVID. That's for sure. They live in constant fear and will try to avoid and numb these emotions. There may be a backlash of poor behavior post-COVID. The trend that this person sees, unfortunately, is that people may just say, I just want to get back to normal. So it will be very interesting to see how it plays out over the next months as restrictions start to be lifted. That will be there. But in any case, Tom, final comments?
We just have each, in terms of that, that's an example though. So within each of our capacities, we each have a role to play in that. And it's, even that's, it might be through talking to our friends and our families, or if we've got a bigger capacity, we'll have a role to shape in whether people say, oh, I just want it to be normal, or whether we try and encourage a different response. So we can all play a role in that, and with whatever capacities or whatever status or power that we have at our disposal.
Yeah. And Chris, final comments from you before we close out?
Well, yes, I do have a comment. It's not exactly a Stoic. I think one of the problems is because people think that the worst effects of climate change are some way off, they don't make the connection between that and the fact that there is only a very short time within which we can make a difference. I think that's one of the problems. We have a very short time in which we can keep things down to the limit, even though the actual full effects of those changes will only come later. I think if that message could be brought out, it would make a difference, because I think that there are these two elements which aren't being put together. So, and I think that will be a task for Stoic wisdom to try and make that connection.
Yeah, thank you. I was reading my good friend John Seller's book on the weekend, and I was taking in some thoughts around Seneca as well. And one quote from John's book in chapter 7, How We Live Together, I'm going to close on and just read it to us from Marcus Aurelius. And it's twofold, really. And the quote is as follows: a branch cut off from its neighboring branch is necessarily cut away from the whole tree. In the same way, a human being severed from just one other human has dropped from the whole community. Now, the branch is cut off by someone else, but a man separates himself from his neighbor by his own hatred or rejection, not realizing that he has thereby severed himself from the wider society of fellow citizens. When I read that, I read it in the context of cutting ourselves off from an individual cutting themselves off from humanity. But when I read it again, I took it wider that, if we don't act, we're cutting ourselves off from nature, and dramatically. Mm-hmm. And the repercussions will be continuing to escalate to a manner that we don't quite fully understand, although the science is very indicative of what may happen. So we, in closing, as a foundation, we want to continue to back the work of Tom Hill and continue to encapsulate it in the Stoic thought that was extremely well presented by Chris today. So once again, we thank everyone for joining us. It's a very important topic. We'll be back with a webinar in the next couple of weeks as well. And I wish everyone a great weekend. Thank you very much. Thank you, Chris, and thank you, Tom, and thank you, Holly, as always.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks for setting it up.